Everyone, this is update for February 2, 2023, day 344 of the war, end of the date update. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of what's going on strategically, globally, and then we're going to switch to Ukraine, as always. So first I'll start with Czech Republic. There is new leadership there, and it's actually very sober and very realistic, which gives hope. Um, Even though I said hope is not, gives a better way to say chance of survival, let's say, for Czech Republic. I'm not saying for everybody. But basically what they said, that China is an enemy. We were living in the world of illusions, and that's the first step. It's like, if you're alcoholic, the first step you realize you're alcoholic. And it seems like the realization in Czech Republic is happening. And that's the first step for healing. The healing is going to be super painful for entire West, but the sooner you start, the better it will be. Less painful it's going to be, but in any case, it's going to be super painful. And then related to China, so this war between West and obviously led by the US and China with respect to the semiconductors continues. As retaliation, China is considering blocking export of solar panels to the West. And just for everybody, those who don't know, essentially China is kind of like a monopoly on the production of solar panels. So essentially, they can stop all of this so-called alternative energy pretty much with the push of a button. And everything is gonna go back to reality, and which again, this will force those coal plants go back and pollute like crazy. And this is result of those misguided energy policies in the West, and China is just taking advantages of the mistakes that's being done. They also finding ways to get over, circumvent those sanctions on the semiconductors. Basically what they're doing, they buying a little bit like 2-3 year old semiconductors, which is pretty powerful. It's still pretty much there, and it's sort of good enough for them, and it's nearly impossible to control that because you need it everywhere in the economy. So they widely sort of distributed, and there is no practical way of controlling export of that. So essentially what this really means, there is no practical way of controlling resale of those semiconductors to both China and Russia, because I think I mentioned Russia actually increased purchases of the semiconductors. Well, they're obviously Western, and but they coming actually, the path is actually interesting. So a lot of it was coming through China, but the other important source is Malaysia, Hong Kong, actually surprisingly Turkey. So as you can see, if you offer high enough price, so will be enough sort of takers to take the risk, and Russia is willing to offer that price. By the way, speaking of Russian economy and how they're doing, the price for euros is hovering around $50 per barrel, which is not wonderful, but it's good enough for Russian economy, for Russian state, for everything to kind of plug along. That means that they constrain, but it's not critical. It's okay, sort of. As I said, they can move forward with that. In terms of internally Russian economy, the automobile industry is really in disaster free fall. Russian car manufacturing industry produced only 450,000 cars in 2022, and even that number is sort of looking into rear view mirror, because it also included 2 months of sort of non-war. Then there were still stockpile of spare parts inventory that's also being used from the West. So in reality, that production probably will be closer to 300,000 if you like take it the run rate. What sort of of all of this sanction constraints on Russia, and the in terms of how many people employed there, it's actually pretty sizable number. It's 3 million people employed in this, not just directly but indirectly, right? If you include all of the supply chain and so on, there are 3 million people employed there initially before the war. How much right now is unclear, but obviously much smaller number. Overall, Russian economy, as I said, is not doing well, even though they painting picture with GDP falling. I don't remember, like 1 to 3% or something like that, which is absolute sort of, I'd say, rubbish, as they say in England. That's absolutely untrue number. Things much worse, because you can see that from the real estate prices in Moscow, both commercial and residential, everything is in free fall, which is unheard of for Moscow, just because Moscow is kind of like in a way, kind of like a spider that sucks all of the blood out of Russia and accumulates it there. Because it's extremely heavily centralized country. Everything flows, all of the like companies registered in Moscow, and essentially they pump all of the financial resources from all of the Russia to come to Moscow, and for that reason the prices there, it's one of the most expensive places in the world, and right now the prices are sort of falling there, which tells you that there's not enough of that blood that's coming out of the entire Russia to support. I would call that parasite on the Russian on Russia. The smaller parasite is Saint Petersburg, but basically the most of it is Moscow, and it's always been like that. It's not just, let's say, phenomenon of this like 20-30 years. During Soviet time, the same situation was true, and during Russian Empire time, that was also true. So it's just how the country is built, and how it existed since forever. Let's put this way. So, and then another thing that's happening in the West is the situation with interest rates, and specifically in US, Federal Reserve System, they increased the interest rate by 0.25% to, I think, between the range 4.5 to 4.75. And they, as I said, they see the light at the end of the tunnel with inflation, in the fight of inflation. In reality, they probably see the light of incoming freight train that's going to hit the entire economy. And the reason for that is because that is probably poorly understood. There is no capital in the world, and willingness, that's another important part, to finance deficits of the US government and US as a society. Because US is basically running deficit, meaning like, living at the expense of other sort of countries who provide capital, or they provide financing for the US to continue living the way they live. And that is becoming a problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, this deglobalization that we discussed many times here. What this really means, that deglobalization, is that the first the trade falls apart, right? Then the profits are not there, and the way and that really means accumulation of capital is not there when the profits are not there. And when you don't have profits and accumulated capital, you don't have ability to provide that capital to the US. And the larger providers of that capital to US is where like Japan, Germany, Europe, let's put this way, China, Russia. So basically, those are main sources. So right now, like for example, like German export is falling down. I think in December it went down 6.3%, and the import is down 6.1. And the not only that it's negative that it went down 6.3, and the even like sort of double sort of whammy, whatever you call it, is that export is falling faster than import, right? What this really means that Germany becoming unprofitable as a, if you really think about it as a household or a company, Germany as that as a household, they become unprofitable. They, as I said, their business model is broken, and so they don't earn. They're not profitable. And so, because they're not profitable, then they cannot provide money to the US. And the same is true for Japan, China. And China is also not only that they're not profitable, there is also unwillingness to do that because essentially it's a you are at war with the West and the US, and the same is true with Russia. I mean, there's I don't even need to discuss Russia, right? So it's very clear and obvious. So all of the sources of financing for the US they dry up, and those sources of financing were financing US consumer, who would then go in return and buy, goods from around the world, mostly from China. But then it's kind of like a sort of complicated scheme. So you get it from China, some of it from Europe, and for China to manufacture those, they need to buy manufacturing equipment from Germany, and so Germany would supply to China. China would manufacture those consumer goods and then sell. And it's very simplified, right? Very primitive explanation, right? It's much more complex, much more difficult, and really, hard to comprehend how complex the system is. But if you really try to at least somehow understand how this works, this whole, I don't know, I cannot call it virtual, maybe this whole circle that I just described, it's effectively broken. And so right now, the Federal Reserve is saying, okay, everything's great. Why I'm saying this? Because they kind of thinking like, okay, well, we sort of conquering inflation, while they really not, because in this situation, when you don't have capital, you need to provide positive return to those who give you capital. And you cannot provide positive return when inflation is higher than the interest you're giving to those who provide you capital. And let's say inflation in the US right running official numbers. So I don't want to even go in discussion on what's the real one, but let's say it's 6-7%, right? The rate is 4.5, 4.75. It's much lower. So nobody will provide you in when the capital is scarce, capital to get destroyed, to lose money effectively. Just you giving the negative proposition to whoever has that capital, and whoever wants to do that. And so that's that's why this whole war, so-called war inflation, is really it's not so much about war and inflation. It's actually really mm, mm, lack of capital. Basically, the capital has been wasted and eaten up in the West over, let's say, starting from 2008. It was destroyed because it was essentially practiced communism uh, since 2008 by in terms of economic policies, and that there was huge destruction that happened to capital since 2008, and now the West is essentially getting to the point where there is a realization there is no capital, or there is close to no capital, or very limited amount of scarcity of it, and you cannot continue all of this deficit, basically living beyond your means. Not only that, like you need to live within your means, you actually need to live even like below because you need to accumulate the capital. So, in other words, this whole excesses that were happening for whatever past 20 years or whatever since actually fall of the Soviet Union, we really can say that because it all kind of coincided because China opened up in that around that time 91, 92, becoming like major sort of supplier of consumer goods to the West. Soviet Union collapsed and you have tons of natural resources flooding from the Soviet Union, the world market, meaning the West, and helping to kind of like reduce inflation and everything, and basically create this prosperity. I don't know, it didn't touch everyone, but let's say whatever we used to accustomed since essentially this 91, 92 time frame, there's good chance it's going to go away for a long time. And so this is what this whole thing is about. It's not just about this primitive view of inflation. It's really about capital has been destroyed, and you have scarcity of capital, and that's where it's all coming from. That's where all of this inflation is coming from. And if there is no stopping in terms of this living beyond your means in the West, and then particularly in the US, because that was sort of the biggest sort of emitter of unbacked credit, the inflation will hit even harder, and the destruction of the living standard will be even stronger in the US and in the West, and you will see even more social unrest in the West. I mean, you already seeing it probably. I think it was like in London, the huge protests. Then it was in France because there is increase in was that retirement age in France, pension age, whatever. It's all, that increase is result of all of this inflation and reduction in the living standard, and like decrease in availability of capital to provide retirement at whatever the age is there, 62 or 64, I don't remember. And that's what's probably poorly understood in the West among the majority of population. Is probably understood by the political top, I think, or partially understood, maybe not even completely. But that's why the depths of the problem, and more economic problem, is huge in the West. In a way, the West is gonna go through like economic restructuring, which is gonna be very painful. And at the same time, there is this conflict in parallel happening between Russia, China, Iran, South Africa, and whoever else is going to join this alliance. And so this is going to be like, colliding worlds that in many ways they are parallel, and sometimes they directly colliding. So it will be very difficult time for everyone. So just kind of wanted to explain what's really happening and why the words of like, oh, we conquered inflation are extremely misguided, and we'll see other things happening. And just to prove that, you can even look at the price of gold, and it went up, I think, $200 or $300 over past, I don't know, just since the war started, or sometime, I think, or maybe since fall. But what this really means is those who have capital, they have choices. One is provide financing to the West, like let's say US and the West in general, right? Or they can put into gold, because gold is always sort of guarantees. And so they choose to put into gold their capital instead of providing financing. And that's what you're seeing in the markets. That's really what's happening. And some of the central banks, like I think Turkish central bank, is actively buying gold. So they also understanding what's really happening. They themselves actually creating that problem in their own country, but it's very, how to say, I'd say, dishonest how they behave. They do something to their own population, one thing, but then for their own preservation, they actually do sort of call it right thing, right? They buying gold. So you see this dynamic happening, and again, those who have capital, they will be more and more realizing, okay, I'm gonna lose my capital, so I'd rather than put it into, piece of, in the yellow metal, so I can, survive through these difficult times, and that will create even more problems with the scarcity of capital to finance anything. So again, we're probably just at the beginning of that long road of restructuring, and we will continue through that, and there will be a lot of social unrest, pain, and everything that comes along with it. Now let's actually move to Ukraine, and Ukraine is going through its own restructuring that eventually, as I said, will be will Ukraine will meet its own what I call 1917 moment, and Russia will meet it too. By the way, nobody will be sort of spared, just at different time and different speeds. Um, so now let's jump to Ukraine. The power grid is still hanging around. Ukraine is becoming a large importer of electricity from the West. At least it tries to. There are constraints because distribution network is severely damaged. So it's not, even if you want to, it's not that really easy to do that. Which again means that Ukraine is putting even more strain on European system and everything in Europe, right? So it increases price of energy in Europe because basically you need to support now Ukraine with that. Not saying that this is wrong. It's in a way sort of at least something is done right, but that's just reality. Ukraine, is um, is extra cost to the problems of the West, and that's why you see sometimes very like populist sort of reactions in the West, where like, okay, why do we support Ukraine? We don't need to support Ukraine, and as if not supporting Ukraine will fix all of the deep problems in the West. This is especially true for there is a group of sort of in the U.S. Parliament that's sort of actively and aggressively against supporting Ukraine, and unfortunately, those are extremely misguided sort of people who basically, I would say, dishonest to themselves and dishonest to the people who they try to represent. But okay, let's now look at do walks through the front line. We're gonna do it in a clockwise fashion, starting from very north, and then we're gonna walk through down south. The situation along the state border is more or less quiet. Nothing major is going on there. Let's now jump to North Lugansk front line. Here, Russian side is somewhat active, continuing what they been doing, attempting to do in the past, basically destroy all of this small bridgeheads that Ukrainian side has established. So far, they're not having any luck since the front line is holding on so far. Now let's move to the North Donbass front line, where things are really not not well, and sometimes there's a feeling that it's gonna really quickly collapse in some kind of like really disorderly disaster here. But let's see. This is might be totally premature saying thoughts. So as you can see over past 2 days, so this is kind of like catch up because I didn't have video yesterday. So the Russian troops managed to capture 2 villages here. One is Mykolayivka and the other one is Sakko and Vantseti. So again, this is basically protecting even more the flank of the potential, well, not potential, but very clear of the Russian attack in the direction, in this sort of in the west and southwestern direction, with the idea of encircling Bakhmut. So let's actually look at that. So, so far there are no sort of progress in the most dangerous area, which is out of Blagodatne towards west and southwest. They're still fighting to, they somewhat stuck trying to capture this Paraskovivka and Krasna Gora, and basically moving in the western direction. They sort of got bogged down for now. Then similar situation is happening here in the south. So far, the Russian side is reporting that they managed to actually capture basically all this area where I'm showing was the forest here along this freshwater channel, basically kind of like make even sort of deeper penetration, more dangerous one, basically getting like west of Ivanivsky, because the most sort of obvious indirect attack is Ivanivsky, but you actually can kind of like even go more towards west of it and make sort of deeper penetration and more dangerous penetration, which what they claim they're doing. I don't have, there's no way to sort of confirm it because it's kind of like in the forest, so there's no, there's no sort of formal confirmation of that. But potentially, this also can be captured by Wagner mercenaries, which obviously, again, negative. And the situation here in south of Bakhmut is extremely dangerous. And as I said, the problem is strategic. It's not just like local problem, just about okay, just a temporary one-off, a problem in Bakhmut or Soledar. This is systemic problem, and as I said before many times, Wagner Group is highlighting this systemic problem in Ukrainian army, that it become well, it always was Soviet army, and there's an unwillingness to change to something different. Let's put it this way. And as long as there is unwillingness to do that, and inability to be fair, the current Ukraine military top and political top just simply incapable. Just at their intelligence level, that's just the nature limitation. The intelligence level does not allow them to do right things, and so they will continue this sort of on this negative path, which will produce more and more negative results. And that's why I'm saying there is every day there is some kind of like crash in the front line, and they're happening more and more frequently. There's a clear indication of potentially impending um, larger collapse, and that will obviously will be very clear. It will be Bakhmut, right? There is no question. It's not going to happen somewhere else. But at the same time, it will open up eventually floodgates, because, as I said before, this fight in this whole area is essentially grinding um, the most valuable resources on the Ukrainian side, which is the soldiers who want to fight, who motivated, who capable to fight, but they are kind of forced to plug the holes with their own bodies. And eventually you will run out of those people, and this is what's really happening. You're really starting to run because you're wasting them, right? It's extremely, that's the most valuable resource, really. It's not equipment, really. It's this kind of people is the most, it's your backbone, it's your skeleton that really holds everything together. And as you lose more and more of them, you have fewer of them in general in your sort of military structure, the military starts to collapse. It just, you hit and it just crashes and you have a hole. And this is really what's probably happening at the high level, if you really think about the Ukrainian military, is that this Wagner group basically chews up all of that the most valuable resource Ukrainian army, Ukrainian society, if you even say, has. And once you have very little of it left, you don't have skeleton to hold everything, and things will be sort of collapsing at faster pace. And no matter what you do, it's like almost like like building castles on the sand. Everything is just falls apart no matter what you do because you don't have motivated people. And that's part of the reason why there's this knee-jerk reaction from Ukrainian military and political top of saying like, okay, if you don't follow the orders, you're gonna go to jail for whatever, I don't remember, 10, 12 years, whatever they say. And they probably realize that they wasted this resource, and they, as I said, there's no intelligence to know, like, to change, to actually do right things strategically. So they just try to sort of force people to sort of die stupidly, and that's not going to happen because you don't have any more, like, you have fewer and fewer people who just willing to blindly die. I mean, and especially when there is this corruption scandals are rocking Ukraine inside. I don't want to discuss those, but people clearly see that there's this political top that's essentially looting the country even during the war. And I'm pretty sure that this is extremely demotivating for people on the front line when they realize, okay, we're dying, so someone can loot and can shine in the limelight on on the Western media. And at some point there's no desire to sort of like underwrite that kind of life. And so there's big there's big risk um, that Ukraine may turn, not yet, but eventually, when the pensions of the society will run out, that Ukraine may turn into, let's say, South Vietnam or Afghanistan, where people just say whatever. We're not underwriting this corrupt top, and and there is sort of this delusional understanding in the West that, like, okay, this corrupt top really represents will of Ukrainian people, or does the right thing for Ukraine. And maybe there is no delusion, maybe there is the realization, but nobody cares. And so there is this brewing problem, and that may materialize. I don't know when, maybe next 6 months or something. I don't know, but there is clearly growing problem, and it's not being resolved, and eventually it will be resolved in very painful way somehow. So that's what's really happening on the Ukrainian side. On Russian, I don't want to even discuss it. Just basically Soviet army, people dying there, and so far there is enough sort of people who are willing to die on the Russian side. This is just, mm, in a way, negative selection that's been happening there over centuries, where people are mm, basically extremely conditioned to behave like a slaves. You die because you are told to do so, and you have significant portion of the society that's like that, and so it will do whatever, if they've been led to the slaughterhouse, they will go without questioning much of it. They're just kind of like nature of sort of the breed of the people there. That's why I said that Ukraine is very different from Russia. There's totally different worlds, even though you know there is always propaganda in Russia that Ukraine is the same, people is the same as Russian. They are as polar opposite as it only gets. um, so let's keep going down south, and let's look what's going on in the central Donbass front line. Things here actually somewhat quiet. The regular Russian military completely failed in their attempts, like Vuhledar failure, Novomikhailivka failure, Velika Novosilka, Marinka, the Spisky salient, the complete failure everywhere. And this is just, the testament of the real capabilities of the Soviet army, which is really essentially all of the Russian army. And again, this we'll see what happens in the Russian sort of political leadership. Mm, but this may force Russian political top to channel more resources to Wagner Group and specifically to Prigozhin, mm, who has this evil entrepreneurial gift that he's channeling for evil purposes, but he's capable, and in a way, Russian military, political top has no choices. They probably don't like him either that much at this point because he's gaining clout. He's politically gaining clout, and they he he becomes potentially political threat, and um, so he's becoming sort of politically dangerous. But they have no choices either because he's delivering results and nobody else. All of this, this attempt by the regular Russian sort of generals to do something completely failed without any results. And so you kind of like have no option but to do that. So again, this was quiet more or less all day, which is extremely unusual for this front line because section of the front line because Russian military is always trying to push gear because even sort of from a tactical primitive level, there's desire to push the front line as far as possible from Donetsk. So there's always desire to attack Ukrainian side here, even though the front line is pretty strong and so on the Ukrainian side. Now let's look at Zaporizhya front line. Things here again also quiet. There was that initial attempt to kind of like test Ukrainian defenses. Apparently, regular Russian military really is thinking what they can do or what is realistic for them. Because as I discussed, they don't have yet that advantage over Ukrainian military in terms of number of soldiers that would allow them, that would guarantee them that they can sort of collapse Ukrainian front line. So they really, and they will not have it across the entire front line. So they really need to select very like narrow section of the front line where they're gonna try to do that, and we'll see if that when that happens. Ever so this whole like the whole idea of the Russian offensive is up in the air, but nobody knows when and where that's gonna happen. That's it for today. Oh, as a sort of administrative, I'll be out for the weekend, so I'll resume after the weekend the regular videos, just as a heads up for everyone. If something totally sort of earth-shattering happening, I'll try to either make a video or put a note on the community board. But beyond that, I'll be out over weekend. So again, thanks everyone, and till Monday, I guess. Thank you. Bye bye.